We're in a series right now in the book of Genesis, which is amazing, and it breaks my brain almost every week. No, every week. We always start out with an illustration. This is our illustration for today. This map represents language families, where different families of languages are spoken in different parts of the world. So you can see right now, at this point in history, the most predominant language family in the world is that Indo-European language family, which is all of the blue. There are a number of others. I'm not going to go through all the funny names that we have for language families. What in the world is a language family? What in the world is that? Well, a language family are a number of languages that we can see how they came from the same source language originally. Right? So one that you might be familiar with is just how a lot of different languages came from Latin in the fairly recent past, over the past 1,000 years, 1,500 years. So French and Spanish and Italian all have similarities. Nod your head if you know what I'm talking about. Yeah. Well, you can trace this even further back, right? So, in fact, all of the languages, basically all of the languages of Europe and this whole Middle Eastern region can be traced back to the Indo-European language family. And we don't know exactly what that language looked like originally, but we can tell that it all comes from one language. There's enough similar words, right, cognates in the languages. Now, here's the weird thing about language families. Nobody's ever found clear links between the families. Think about that for a minute. Nobody's ever found clear links. Now, there's lots of theories out there about, it must be the case that all human languages came from one language to begin with. Lots of people think that because of the theory of evolution. The idea that human beings evolved over a long period of time, and so language must have happened at some point in time, and then over a long period of time, that language spread and branched out to all human beings. But if that's true, no one's ever found a link, a clear link between all of these language families. It's almost like in the beginning, somehow, there were a whole bunch of different human languages. Well, that doesn't make any sense. How could that be? Language is a dramatic thing to suddenly come on the human scene. It wouldn't have happened more than once if the evolutionary idea is right. How could there have been lots of very different languages from which all modern language originated? It's almost like at some point human language was changed or made into a bunch of different languages. We're going to be looking today at the story in Genesis chapter 11 of the Tower of Babel, where the Bible says God did something that looks a lot like this. He confused the languages of human beings into a bunch of different languages. Interesting. We're in a series, like I said, on Genesis. It's called The Good, the Bad, and the Faithful. Genesis is like a Wild West story, and we're going to be using that metaphor more and more as we go along, and you're going to see some of that today. All right, now where were we last week in the story of Genesis? Can anybody remember? Last week there was a huge disaster last week, right? So last week we talked about the flood, and we covered a lot of ground last week. In one message, we covered Genesis chapter 6, 7, 8, and 9, all in 1 week. It was actually pretty good. I think we did it in a concise way. Today we are going to cover a lot less ground in the actual text. We're just going to look at a little piece from Genesis 10, which is called the Table of Nations. I'll talk about that in a minute. And then we're going to look at the first section in Genesis 11, which is the story of the Tower of Babel. The Tower of Babel is going to tell us, this is our origin story, our Genesis origin story. It tells us not only what happened in history, it is history, but it tells us about human life. And actually, Genesis makes sense of human life in a way that nothing else in the world does. It helps us understand why human life goes the way that it does. And you're going to see, you've already seen if you've been here, you're going to see repeated in your life and the lives of people around you. And if you know history, you're going to see repeated in history the same things we see happening over and over again in Genesis. Okay, but before we get into that, I want to do something that I'm going to call the Gospel of Genesis. Okay? I want to do a little bit of a recap of what we've looked at so far in Genesis, and I want to do it in the form of the gospel. Now, what is the gospel? The gospel is something we talk about usually when we're talking about the New Testament, right? The books of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, which are called gospels. Gospel means good news, and we often talk about it here at Community of Hope as the main message of the Bible. If we were going to say, what is the main message of the Bible, the whole Bible, it's the gospel. Now, you've probably heard many times the gospel is everywhere in the Bible, not just in the New Testament, but you might have a fuzzy idea of how that is. Have we seen the gospel in Genesis so far? So we have, and we're going to point that out for just a moment here so you can grab onto that, and we'll use this as a way of recapping. Now, first of all, what is the gospel? So the gospel, the way that we talk about it here, we usually talk about it in 4 points. There are 4 points to the gospel, the main message of the Bible. The first one is that there is a God of love. There is a God who created the world. He created you and me, and the main thing you need to know about him is love. He loves you, he loves me, he loves everybody who's been made. The second point of the gospel is that something bad happened, right? Sometimes we call this the fall. We talked about this, we'll get back to where this fits in Genesis, but sin came into the world. Human beings did something wrong, and the reason, why is there a division symbol here? Sin divides us from God. It divides us from God, and it divides us from each other. So there's a God of love, but sin has come into the world. People have chosen to do wrong, and that divides us from God and from others. The cross is the ultimate expression of God's mercy and redemption. Even though we have rebelled against God, we've turned away from him, we've sinned, God is constantly at work in the world to bring us back to him. That's mercy and redemption. And then finally, the response to this message. The fourth point of it is, how are you going to respond? What God is asking us to do is put our faith in him. Trust him. Okay, so that's the gospel. God of love, sin divides, mercy and redemption, and response in faith. Have we seen this in the book of Genesis? Now I want you to see this because the gospel really is everywhere. It's not something that just, Jesus even invented. It's something that's been from the very beginning. I guess maybe he did invent it, but it's not something he just brought when he came as a human being. It's something that was from the beginning. God has been trying to communicate this to the human race the whole time we've been around. First of all, where do we see the idea of the God of love? We see it in creation and in the garden, right? Remember in Genesis 1 and 2, we see God is creating the world, and we even talked about how you get a sense in there of how much God loves what he's creating. What does God say each day in Genesis 1 after he creates? He stops and he looks at it, what he's made. And what does he say? It is good. And what does he say when he creates the human beings? It is very good. It is very good. You have a God of love right there from the beginning in Genesis. Then, of course, this is pretty obvious. Where does sin come in Genesis? It comes in what we call the fall, right? So we talked about this, the serpent, the curse. There's a snake that deceives Adam and Eve. And Adam and Eve eat from the tree that they're not supposed to eat from, at least not yet. We talked about that quite a bit. And then things get worse and worse, right? There's a curse because of that. There are consequences to sin. And then, of course, Cain, the first pair of brothers, one murders the other. And then the world spirals down even faster, and that's what we talked about last week, is an absolute disaster. Human life becomes a disaster as a result of this. It seems like an irredeemable disaster. It seems like there's no way to fix it. And in a sense, there is no way to fix it. But you also see in Genesis this idea of mercy and redemption. You see it all over the place. You see it right at the moment when Adam and Eve rebel against God. Instead of striking them dead with a lightning bolt, what does God do? He meets with them. He explains what's going to happen. He tries to teach them how to live the right way. He makes clothing for them. The whole purpose of making them clothing is so they don't have to hide because of their shame. So that now they can interact with each other and hopefully interact with God. He's still present with them even after they've disobeyed him, and he still tries to protect them. Even after Cain murders his brother, God's still trying to protect Cain. He's trying to bring the human beings back from the very beginning. There's even more than that in Genesis. And then this idea of faith. And this is where we're getting to in Genesis, because the whole second half, and it's not half of the book, it's the book divides into two parts, but the second half is much longer than the first half. So it's not actually half. But the whole second section of Genesis is going to be about faith. What does it look like to walk with God? What does it look like to trust God, even if you're totally dysfunctional and you keep messing stuff up all the time? I don't know if that describes you. It describes me pretty often. Don't raise your hand. The whole second half of the book is going to be about God's not looking for really good people. There aren't any. He's looking for anyone who will trust him enough to try to do what he says. And he finds some of those people, and he says, I can work with that. I can take these people and I can use them to redeem the whole world eventually. And so we've got building in Genesis, we've got the idea that Enoch walked with God. And then Noah, we saw last week, Noah was saved because he was this amazing guy. No. Noah was brought through the flood because, we talked about last week, as his walk with God, he's willing to say in his life, I'm not good enough. I can't do it on my own. I need your help. And in fact, he's almost the only person on the earth who's willing to say it at that point. So Noah is saved through the flood because he's willing to walk with God. So that is sort of a little recap of where we've been at and the flood, the rest of the stuff early in Genesis, and I hope you can see that the gospel is right there the whole time. This message that's throughout the Bible really is there from beginning to end. All right, this week, the message is entitled The Rebel. And we are going to talk about a particular person to begin with. This is Genesis 10. So this is after the flood. What's happened is, Noah, we talked about last week, Noah does some bad stuff. One of the very first things, what's the first thing Noah did after the flood? He sacrificed, he worshiped God. So he went to church. That would be our equivalent. Or maybe he spent time, just worshiping God on his own. You might spend time worshiping God during the week, maybe through music or through prayer. He worshiped God. And then immediately after that, he went and got really, really drunk. Noah did some bad stuff. And then his family, we won't talk about exactly what happened, but Ham in particular, that's Noah's son. His son Ham did some really bad stuff. And in fact, Noah ends up cursing his son and grandson Canaan as a result. So massively dysfunctional family right off the bat out of the ark. But this family begins to spread out, and they have lots of kids, and sort of Genesis 10 fast forwards us in time. And the human race spreads out, and there's now lots of human beings. They're repopulating the earth. And this is what it says. Now, some of you are going to think, these names don't matter. Never say that in the Bible. The names in the Bible, you might not always know what they mean, but they are there for a very important reason. We're going to see some of that today. The sons of Ham, who were Cush, Egypt, Put, and Canaan. The sons of Cush, Seba, Havilah, Sabta, Ramah, and Sabteka. The sons of Ramah, Sheba and Dedan. Cush fathered Nimrod. He was the first on earth to be a mighty man. Who wants to be a mighty man? Anybody want to be a mighty man? Sounds like a men's conference. We're going to have a men's retreat in the spring. We're going to be talking about that coming up. Should we call it the Mighty Man Retreat? There are retreats called that. I think that's so corny when you talk about mighty men. The first on earth to be a mighty man. He was a mighty hunter. So it's talking about Nimrod here, which is also not a very nice term in modern English. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. Therefore, it is said, so this is a saying from way back in history, Like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before the Lord. People would compare themselves to him. The beginning of his kingdom was Babel, Uruk, Akkad, Calneh in the land of Shinar. From that land, he went into Assyria, and he built Nineveh, Rehoboth-ir, Calah. Oh, I should have had a little bit more of that verse. He built a bunch of places in Assyria. Okay, let's talk about this for a minute, because this is important to understand. First of all, we already said here who Ham is, right? So Ham is the son of Noah who did a bunch of bad stuff. So this is the one that Noah curses, and Canaan is his grandson. Now, Cush is one of his other sons, and we see that as time goes on, Cush ends up fathering Nimrod. This does not mean that Cush was actually Nimrod's father. There are probably many generations between Cush and Nimrod. This is an interesting part of Genesis 10 because it's just listing off people, and then all of a sudden it takes the time to tell us about this one particular person and tell us some things about his life. He was obviously a very famous person in his time, Nimrod. He was the first on earth to be a mighty man. I said that's a little bit corny to me. This is not a nice term in the Hebrew text. In fact, it is not saying Nimrod was a great man. It is saying he is great in the sense of he was awesome, he was scary, he was a dangerous person in many ways. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. You might think that this means he had some good relationship with the Lord. Actually, the way that the Hebrew text reads here, he was a mighty hunter sort of in spite of the Lord, or before the Lord in a sense of almost in your face. I'm going to do whatever I want. This saying, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before the Lord, this is something that people used to brag about themselves. And you'll notice, where was the beginning of Nimrod's kingdom? Babel. So we're about to read about the Tower of Babel in Genesis 11. This is Nimrod's kingdom that we're going to read about. Nimrod, in fact, his name is maybe not even a name. Nimrod in Hebrew means the rebel. So if you were reading this, if you were listening, one of the Israelites listening to Moses when he first wrote this down and read it to the people, what you would read is, Cush fathered the rebel. And that rebel was the first on earth to be a strong man. To be a strong man. Just in the 20th century, that term strong man has been used of certain world leaders who were some of the worst that we've ever had. People like Hitler. People like Stalin. You know what Stalin means? The man of steel. That's what it means. Everybody's looking for Superman. That's actually what's happening here, I think. And we'll see that in the story of the Tower of Babel. Everybody's looking for a savior. But we end up looking in the wrong places. We look to human beings who cannot possibly save us. But Nimrod was such a good hunter. He was so tough. He was able to defeat his enemies in battle. He must be the one who can save the human race. No, he's the one who rebels against God. There's a lot more here in the names, guys. Uruk, we'll come back to in a few minutes. These are real places, by the way. One of the many ways that we know that this is actual history that's being recorded for hundreds of years. For hundreds of years after the Enlightenment, it was assumed that these places were all made up and that this was just a myth. And then we found them. We found particular scrolls and tablets that list the names of these places. Does anybody know? So the Epic of Gilgamesh, we mentioned it a couple of weeks ago. Is anybody an avid reader of the Epic of Gilgamesh? You should read the Epic of Gilgamesh. It's amazing. It was discovered in the 1850s in excavation of the city of Nineveh in the palace of the Neo-Babylonian king Ashurbanipal. And in that text, the great hero is from the city of Uruk. a great powerful warrior named Gilgamesh, who's also a mighty hunter. What? Crazy. Okay, we'll move on from here. This is a quote from Josephus. Anybody know Josephus? Okay, Josephus was a Jewish leader and historian a little bit after the time of Jesus, so thousands of years ago, still a long, long time after Moses, and certainly a long time after Nimrod. But I just want you to see how the Jewish people have traditionally understood Nimrod and who he was. Here's what Josephus says. Now it was Nimrod who excited them, all the people, to such an affront and contempt of God. Nimrod was an enemy of the Lord. He was the grandson of Ham, the son of Noah, a bold man and a man of great strength of hand. He persuaded the people not to ascribe it to God, so not to have gratitude toward God. Pastor Jason was talking about that earlier. He convinced the people not to say that the good things they have are from God, as if it was through his means that they were happy, but to believe that it was their own courage which procured that happiness. So he convinced everybody to believe it's my own strength that's done everything. He also gradually changed the government into a tyranny. What's a tyranny? That's like totalitarian government, right? Really bad place to live. These places were not happy places. Seeing no other way of turning men from the fear of God, but to bring them into a constant dependence on his own power. All right. So some things we can take from this, and you can write down in your notes to begin with. Human beings were created good. We saw that in the Gospel of Genesis. God made people good. But we have actually fallen beyond human repair. This is a key point of the gospel. We find it in Jesus' teaching. We find it in Genesis. There is no human solution for human problems. There is no human solution. What's wrong with you and what's wrong with the world, you can't fix it. I can't fix it. Justin Trudeau can't fix it. We know that, right? Nobody can. Donald Trump can't fix it. Hitler can't fix it. Stalin can't fix it. No, there is no Superman. There is no Superman that's just a human being. We've all been looking for a Savior. There is only one Savior. His name is Jesus. He is the only one who can fix it. There is no human solution. And also, we keep trying to set ourselves up to be God. And that's the sense that you get from Nimrod, the rebel. That's the sense that you get from what Josephus was saying about him and what you're about to see with the Tower of Babel, okay? We keep trying to put ourselves in the place of God. We don't need to be grateful to him. It's not God who's given me everything I have. I worked for it. I did it all on my own. Let me ask you this question. All the money you have in your bank account, did you make it? Is it the result of just of you? Could you have done it on your own? Did you do it on your own? The answer is no, absolutely not. A tower in the east. So we're about to read the section on the Tower of Babel. I showed you guys this picture before. This is in Iraq, and there's this sign. This is the remains of a ziggurat. So a ziggurat, I'll show you what it looks like. A couple more pictures in a minute. We've talked about this. This is what the Tower of Babel almost for sure looked like. Not this. This is a ruined one. But this is the current remains of the ziggurat of Uruk. The ziggurat of Uruk. Yes, we actually know where this town was. One of the cities where Nimrod ruled and where the Epic of Gilgamesh says Gilgamesh was king, this mighty hunter and warrior. And you see this sign that says the first written words started here. Because, as far as we can tell, the Epic of Gilgamesh may have been the first thing that was ever written down in human history. Interesting. Here is a reconstruction. This is actually in another place in Iraq. This is the ziggurat of Ur, so just U-R. Does that name sound familiar from Genesis? For those of you who know Genesis? This ziggurat is in the hometown of Abraham. Abraham was from Ur. Ur of the Chaldeans, Ur of the Babylonians. This has been reconstructed so that only in part. It would have had several other layers on top of it as well. It's sort of a step pyramid, right? So big base and then smaller and smaller so you could get really high. And this is what the Tower of Babel would have looked like. I showed you this video a couple of weeks ago as well. This is sort of a digital artist reconstruction of a ziggurat and then the city that would be around it. Because what you're going to see in Genesis 11 is they're not just building a tower. And it's not really a tower in the way that we would think of it. It's like a pyramid, a special kind of pyramid. But they're doing it in order to build a city. And this is one more artist's illustration because we do know that these ziggurats had trees on them. And so it would not have looked just like a barren wasteland. What might this have reminded ancient people of? Any thoughts? Do we remember where did God put people when he first made human beings in Genesis 2? Where did he put them? In the Garden of Eden. And rivers flowed out of Eden, didn't they? Which means Eden was a hill. They're rebuilding the Garden of Eden. That's what they're trying to do. This is what we've been trying to do ever since we messed up in the beginning. It's what we're still trying to do today, not quite as literally as they did. We're trying to fix what's wrong. We're trying to rebuild what we've lost. We're trying to get back to the garden. Here's Genesis 11 and the actual story of the Tower of Babel. Now, the whole world had one language and a common speech. As people moved eastward, they found a plain in Shinar and settled there. They said to each other, "Come, let's make bricks and bake them thoroughly." They used bricks instead of stone and tar for mortar. Again, another place we can see that Genesis is actual history. This is what the ziggurats were made out of. Go look it up. You can just go find it on Wikipedia if you want. The Bible knew that all the way from the beginning, all the way from the time of Moses, knew exactly what the ziggurats were made out of. Thoroughly baked brick and overlaid with tar. Interesting. They said, so the people of this plain, possibly directly under the leadership of the rebel, of Nimrod, or maybe his descendants, it's a little hard to tell, but I'm going to assume that he's there. They said, "Come, let's build ourselves a city with a tower that reaches to the heavens, so that," now here's where they say why they're building it, "so that we may make a name for ourselves. Otherwise, we will be scattered over the face of the whole earth." Now, this is amazing because I think sometimes we have a picture, when I was a kid, I didn't really go to church, but I had heard about the Tower of Babel because it's really interesting and a great story for kids. I imagined them actually trying to build a tower up to outer space. That's what I imagined. I imagined it was really skinny because how else could you get that high? And I imagined that it was, it probably wobbled a lot at the top. And I imagined that the goal was they thought God was up there and they were going to actually get all the way up to where God is. And I thought, wow, it's really good that they didn't make it because there's no air up there. And if they had made it, they would have just suffocated and died. That was my thinking as a kid. But the text in Genesis actually tells us why they build the tower. They are not actually trying to reach God. What they're trying to do is build a city. So think about it this way. What had God told the human beings to do? God had told the human beings originally to go scatter all over the earth and have children and fill the earth. And one of the very first things that happens after the flood is they say, no, let's stick together. We don't want to go scatter all over the earth because to do that requires a kind of trust in God. I'm scared if I go out and live on my own somewhere in the wilderness with just a few people. I would rather stay together with a whole bunch of people. I'm going to make myself safe. Do you see it? What else can you do if you build a city that you can't do if you just have like a small group of people somewhere else? Do you remember what Cain had built a city before the flood? Why did Cain build a city? He built a city so he could control people. Cain built a city so that he didn't have to work the ground himself. Cain built a city so that he could make other people his servants. It's exactly what's happening here. What did Josephus tell us about Nimrod, the rebel? That the government of his city was what? Was it a democracy? Everybody got to vote? No. The government of his city was a dictatorship, a tyranny. You can think of this, actually somebody else brought this to me this morning. We were doing Bible study. Come to Bible study, so fun, 8:30. We're talking about this. They literally build a pyramid as the first pyramid scheme in history. The point of building the pyramid is so that Babylon, the word Babylon comes originally from the Akkadian language, and it means the gate of the gods. They built this huge tower so that Nimrod, or whatever leader was there, could say, we are closer to God than everyone else, so come and live in my city and let me rule you. If you go and look up anything about these cities, probably as much as half of the population were slaves in the city. And the rest of them were in a very clear hierarchy with the leader right at the top. The leader literally sat on top of a pyramid, looked down on everyone else, and said, I rule you. They build a pyramid, and the pyramid is the first pyramid scheme in history. But this is what we do. God disciplines us in his mercy. And this is where we're going to take some really good points for our own lives out of this text today. Because the thing is, right, it's true, you know you should not set yourself up as God. You know you should not think that you can do it all. But there probably aren't too many people in here who are trying to rule a whole city. I don't know if anybody has a coup ready. They're about to stage a coup and take over Surrey. I hope not. Don't do that. It's a bad idea. There might be a few people in here who are tempted to do that in their own family. I don't know. Don't do that either. Don't rule your family like a tyrant. But in this next section, we're going to see what God does, and we're going to draw some clear lessons out of this for our own lives that are very important. The Lord came down to see the city and the tower the people were building. Now, I got to pause here for a minute because it is very hard to tell if there are parts of the Bible that are intended to be funny. But I think there are. Now, I don't mean that the whole story is a joke, but I mean that this was intended to draw a contrast between what the people are doing and what God is doing in a way that is dramatic. Like Jesus saying, it's easier for a rich person, for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich person to enter the kingdom of heaven. The human beings have just tried to build a tower to get to God, right? They just tried to build a tower that reaches the heavens. And God looks down from heaven. And he says to his angels, let's go all the way down there and see what the humans are doing. Do you see the humor? They're not even close, right? The human beings try to do this, and they're not even close. I mean, we know this today. We've now made it to outer space, and we're still not even close. In fact, all we've done by reaching outer space is find out how much bigger the universe is than we ever thought it was before. The Lord said, if as one people speaking the same language they have begun to do this, then nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them. God knew something about human beings way back then, given to Moses in prehistory almost, that has turned out to be true. That if human beings are united and we're able to communicate with each other and we work on something together, we can accomplish basically anything. There's almost nothing we plan to do that is impossible for human beings. You would think this is a good thing, right? Isn't that a good thing that human beings can do almost anything? No, not if what we're trying to do is evil. This is the point. To God, what God is saying in this moment is this is terrible. These human beings have the ability to accomplish almost anything, but they are focused on evil. They are being led by the rebel. They are going to destroy each other in dramatic ways that they haven't even imagined yet. They are in incredible danger. Come, let us go down and confuse their language so they will not understand each other. So the Lord scattered them from there over all the earth, and they stopped building the city. This is why it was called Babel, because the Lord confused the language of the whole world. From there the Lord scattered them over the face of the whole earth. I'm not going to spend too much time focusing on the very facts here, right? What it says is that God changed their languages so that they could not communicate with each other. And that therefore he also sort of drove them out so that some of them went very far away from where they originally had been. This is the Bible's explanation for the way the world is today, or the way it has been in the past anyway. But the point I want to focus in on is this: God disciplines us in his mercy. And this is a hugely practical point for our lives. So many times in your life, you've had something happen, and you said, why did God allow that to happen? That was horrible. That was so hard. It seems like this thing, I just can't fix it no matter what. Why won't God? What do you think these people in the city of Uruk or Babel said when God destroyed their city and destroyed their tower? When their whole government, their whole civilization collapsed and separated. God hates us. God's against us. God's our enemy. He's not a God of love. He's like the worst. And yet, God was doing this in his mercy. He allowed that thing to come. Actually, he sent that confusion and destruction into their lives so that something worse didn't happen. This is a picture of a little blonde boy lighting a fire. When I was 5 years old, I went out with my best friend into the woods behind his house, and we knew that if we worked on it together, we could light a fire. And that would be so awesome. We would prove just how manly, what mighty men we were if we could light this fire on our own without any grown-ups. And we did it. We lit a fire. And when my friend's mom saw the smoke, she came running out at full speed, and she destroyed our fire. She absolutely annihilated it. She threw water on it. She tossed pieces of it different directions so that it would go out. She kicked dirt on it, and then she punished us. She was evil and hated us. She was the one mom in the world that didn't love her children. She disciplined us in her mercy because we had no idea what we were starting. That's Babel. That's what happened in Babel. The human beings had no idea where this was going to go. From our vantage point in history, now having seen some of the stuff that happened in the 20th century, we can imagine some of the places Babel would have gone. Horrific things, even almost unspeakable things. But God separates them. He scatters them so that it doesn't happen. This is Hebrews chapter 12, verse 5, and a way that we can apply this to our lives. Have you completely forgotten this word of encouragement that addresses you as a father, that addresses you as a father addresses his son? It says, "My son or my daughter, do not make light of the Lord's discipline. Do not lose heart when he rebukes you. Because the Lord disciplines the one he loves. He chastens everyone he accepts as a child, as his son or daughter. Endure hardship," this meaning whatever hardships come into your life, "as discipline." God is treating you like his children. For what children are not disciplined by their father? If you were not disciplined, because everyone undergoes discipline, if you were not disciplined, then you would not be legitimate children. You wouldn't be true sons and daughters at all. Moreover, we all had human fathers and mothers. They disciplined us, and we respected them for it. How much more should we submit to the Father of our spirits and live. Let's jump forward. The final thing we'll look at today is just pointing forward to what's coming. God is sort of buying time here. He wants to bring the human beings back to himself, and they are trying to destroy themselves faster than he's going to be able to redeem them, actually. So he scatters them over the face of the whole world at Babel. But God's plan is better than ours. He has a plan to bring us back. And this is what we're going to start looking at beginning next week, is the story of Abraham. So his name originally is Abram. God changes his name later. I'll usually call him Abraham. And he is a man who is willing to trust God. He's just like Noah. He's not a really good guy. There's a lot of messed up stuff in Abraham's life, just like there's a lot of messed up stuff in my life and in your life. But he's willing to trust God, and he's reaching out to God for help. And God is searching through the world, and as he does in those days, he's looking for a way. He's got people like this rebel Nimrod who are trying to take over and rule everybody else. He's looking for anybody who might reach out to him and trust him. And he finds Abraham. And he says, I can work with that. I'm going to take this one man, and I'm going to train him and his family over generations, maybe even thousands of years. And I'm going to use them to restore the whole world. So the Lord said to Abram, go from your country, your people, your father's household, and the land I will show you. Go from the land of Nimrod. Go from the land of tyranny and control and all of these people trying to fix all their own problems in their own way. Head out west. I will make you into a great nation. I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you. Whoever curses you, I will curse. And all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. He's going to take one man of faith, and he's going to change the world. God has a subversive plan to redeem the world. A plan on how to bring us back, but not top down, not by coming down from the clouds and forcing us to do what he wants, but by creating a new kind of life in the world. Ultimately, that life will be shown in his son, Jesus. Let's pray. We'll continue in worship.